Welcome to Soltron. Today we're going to do some customizing. There's things I've been wanting to fix about this figure ever since I got him, and then kind of the same with this guy. So today we're just going to focus on basically bicep swivels. So I'm going to put a ball joint here in the elbow, which should allow him to bend his elbow more than this 45 degrees, and it'll give him bicep swivel, which will be nice because he has none. And then I also want to work on giving him more outward motion. Here, I've already taken this apart, so I already know this is going to be very easy. So just giving him more outward motion on this arm, getting rid of this kibble on the back of his arm right here, this panel, and just attaching that to his forearm instead of having it lock in his elbow. So that'll be pretty easy. Another little goal I want to do if I have time, if this doesn't take too long, is I want to give him pivoting feet here so that he's got like some ankle rockers so his feet don't just look like they look right now. In an A stance, they just look very wrong. They're just not flush with the floor. They don't do anything. They don't help stabilize him. They're not even touching the ground at this point. So that needs a lot of work. And then with this guy, I figured I could fix most of the issues I have with him. Instead of giving him bicep swivels, I'm just going to put ball joints in his shoulders here for this connection port. And that will actually let him basically swing his arm around good enough. So that'll actually fix most of the issue of not having bicep swivel. So that's my, 4-ish goals for the customizing today. And then a couple of things I just want to show you. This will just be like a future goals thing, but this guy is actually very annoying. Like his head doesn't rotate, and that's because when they designed him, they actually gave him this rectangular post for a neck, which is pretty poor because they could have just made this a mushroom peg and then he'd be able to turn his head. So that's something I'm going to want to fix. Not today, but that'll be in the video for giving head articulation, neck articulation, which I have a couple of figures that have the same issue. So that'll be something I'll fix up. And then the other thing is I recently did this review on this guy, Metal Cardbot Dexter, and I was really annoyed about, I was somewhat annoyed that his legs look like this on the package art. Like he's got these cool knee flaps. He's got like the yellow goes all the way down to his ankle pretty much. But in reality, his leg looks like this. So it looks like he's wearing, some kinds of shorts or something. And then he's got all this black. And then I found out, well, of course, so I started taking him apart because that's what I do. So I unscrewed his leg because I noticed that this and this were actually separate. And I was wondering, maybe there is like some kind of joint in there I just totally missed somehow. But there's not. But I looked at this and I just cannot figure out why they didn't design this. First off, having this plate right here makes it so he can't lift his leg very much. Now that the plate is unscrewed, he can do a full 90 degrees on the leg. So I wonder why they didn't just put the knee here and then make this calf section, make that a little bit shorter, just have that more in the yellow section, and just give him more of a yellow or more of this leg. And then they could have also put his knee armor would go right there, and basically he would have a leg that looks more like the box. Why they didn't do this, I have no idea. Just bad design. So that's something I'll probably end up fixing in the future. Plus, he doesn't have thigh swivel anyway. So if I put a ball joint here, then he'll actually be able to thigh swivel as well. So that'll be a nice fix in the future, which will help me like this figure more. And then I'll probably cut off these terrible hands and give him hands you can actually see. So I think that will fix some of what I don't like about this guy. Anyway, that's for another day. So let's start with this guy, because I've already disassembled him and taken a look at what's going on. So let's look at everything that's in his shoulder here. So the first easy fix is, so I just unscrewed all these screws in the back. That's pretty easy. So I definitely want to get rid of this ugly arm panel that limits his articulation. So you can just unscrew that. It comes right off. I'm going to have that be attached to his forearm instead. So it's kind of just going to be here. And that way he's got clearance to actually have an elbow joint, because otherwise this just gets in the way and he won't be able to rotate his elbow. So that'll be an easy thing to fix. And then if we look in the shoulder here, so if we take all this apart, we can see the inner workings of his outward motion on his shoulder. You can see it's got this ratchet joint and it just rotates here, and that's where it stops. And you can see it's because they formed this in kind of a weird way. So all I have to do is shave down this plastic, and that will give him one more click, and then he'll have a good amount of outward arm articulation as opposed to what he currently has, which is basically one click out. So he can actually move his arm out this much, which makes a difference. It's kind of, it might break the mold a little bit, but at least he'll have more articulation. So that'll be a really easy fix. I'll just do that right now. So I'll just get my hobby knife and I'll just trim this plastic down so that that joint can rotate out a little bit more freely. And like I always say, this doesn't need to look pretty. It's going to be on the inside. No one's going to see it. It just needs to be more round. Okay, so that's already a little bit more round. So let's test fit that and see if that fixes our issue. So we'll just put that back in the joint here. And then there's still some resistance. I'm not sure what's causing that. This last click is still a little bit difficult. I think it's actually maybe this section here might be a little bit too high up. Maybe if I just relieve some of that by just shaving it a little bit shorter so that the ratchet joint can just get around it a little bit easier. Let's see if that helps. Oh yeah, okay. So now that's nice and good. All of these pretty much click. So I'm gonna put on the back shell and just make sure everything still works when it's all assembled. Okay, it's still a little bit tough, so I definitely need to take off more material. Okay, and now that I look more closely at this, I see what the actual issue is this little detailed piece here in the bicep is actually running into this black plastic here. So actually what needs to happen is you can see this black plastic just needs to be shaved down basically 1 millimeter just to give clearance to this bicep. So we'll just pop that out. And then I was looking at that on camera, so I wasn't looking very closely, but basically right here is all that needs to be shaved down. So we'll just clean that up a little bit. And then especially when you're cutting towards your own hands, you definitely want to go slow and steady and have a good grip so that nothing slips and cuts you. When I was first customizing, or even years and years into customizing, I would just cut my fingers all the time because I just would not control the knife correctly. So I can definitely tell what's going to be a risky cut and what's not. And you can definitely lower your risk by just having a good grip on your hobby knife. Making sure it doesn't slip. So, all right, so let's check that out. And then you can see I cut like way more than I needed, which is kind of normal. I only really need to cut like this little corner right here. It needs to be a little bit shorter, just really this little piece right there. Okay, there we go. That looks like that's nice and snug now, so I can just put the back cover back over his shoulder. And then we test out that joint again. And there we go. Now he's got that full outward motion. It doesn't have ridges for the ratchet to catch. I guess I could make that if I cared enough, but he's got that full outward motion. That's all that really matters. I could make this less slippery. Oh, fine. I guess I'll just do it. So I'll just take a look at this. So I need to cut a little groove right here where the ratchet is actually touching the plastic. I'll just make a small little groove right there, and that will give something for the ratchet tooth to actually sink into, just to hold up his bicep. Why not? It's only going to take a second. Okay, I literally just cut a little groove right there. It's barely even visible, but that groove is there. And now when we reinsert this, now the ratchet has something to sink into, so now this actually holds up decently. I could make the groove even deeper, but you know what? It gets the job done. It's now got a good ratchet. It doesn't just slip. So shoulder mod is done. And then there is one other little issue, is this little bit of plastic is like running into this. So I'm just going to nick that off. Okay, it's gone. And now he's got that full ratchet joint. As you can see, full outward. Now he's looking good. All right, now for the hard part, you can see I already took the pin out of this guy. So the way I like to take pins out is basically I just try to figure out which side of the pin has the rough edge, and I'll put that down against the table, and then I'll get my screwdriver and I'll hold that on the other end of the pin, which this whole thing needs to be disassembled to actually access the other end. So you can see this is where the other end of the pinhole was. So I just put my screwdriver here and basically put this on the edge of the table, and then just hit the end of this with a hammer, and that just basically pops out the pin just a little bit. That's all you need. And then you just use some needle nose pliers and you just pull it out the rest of the way. These pins are actually well assembled, so you do need a hammer to punch them out. But that's how I always punch pins out. That usually works. I don't usually have to heat them up or anything because that is a hassle and I don't like to do any extra steps. So anyway, you can see this is his forearm assembled. So what I'm going to basically do is, I think I'll put in one of these ball joints. He's actually a big figure, so I'm debating on whether I should use a bigger ball joint. Yeah, because his bicep is pretty skinny, I'm actually going to go with this ball joint because it's actually the right size. It's the same size as his bicep pretty much, as opposed to one of these Strux ball joints, which is a little bit too big, I think. I don't think that's going to look very good, having this giant ball joint there. It just doesn't really work. And plus, he doesn't have a lot of heavy things to lift with his elbow, so this joint will actually do the job. So all this is a Lego ball joint, and it's got a little rubber pad in it. I really like these because they have a good amount of friction. They still won't carry a crazy amount of weight, so you can't use them for everything, but they're good for like an application like this. So basically, I'm going to have it so the ball joint, this end of the ball joint is basically just going to be shoved. So I'm going to cut off all this plastic and then shove that ball joint there. And then this gray piece is basically just going to recess right here where there's already like a cutout. And then like something to consider if you're using these kinds of ball joints, you might be tempted to, if let's say that this is the bicep, and try to wedge this on. It's kind of malformed. But you might be tempted to install the ball joint like this. And this is how I used to do it. And then let's say this is the forearm. So this is like a resting position. And then, okay, just have to adjust that ball joint. So then you'd be like, okay, so this is the let's say this is the forearm. This is the bicep. So if you install the ball joint or the socket so it's facing down, you get your bicep swivel, you can get a 90-degree bend, and then you can still have swivel, right? So that looks like it would actually accomplish what you need to do, but actually it's better to actually install this socket this way so that it's backwards, and then the ball joint is like facing the elbow, and then just attach this to this, the forearm. And then when you do it like this, so that the ball joint is like sticking out in a way, you actually get more than 90 degrees on the bicep, on the elbow. So you can get more than a 90-degree elbow using these same ball joints if you just like extend it going this way. And then it kind of blocks it from breaking the elbow back the other way. Whereas if you install it this way, you can just bend the elbows the wrong way, which looks wrong. And then you're only going to get a little bit more than 90 degrees depending on how you install it. So it's actually better to install these sockets facing backwards. And you'll see, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll see a little bit more of that in a second. So first things first, I'm just going to cut this whole thing just right across there using my Dremel bit. Here's the bit that I'm talking about. So this is like a sanding disc, or a cutting disc. You have to be careful not to bend these because they're very brittle and they'll break right away. And it's probably a good idea. You see it cuts really nicely and very quickly. It's probably a good idea to wear safety goggles when you have this on too, because I'm always paranoid that the disc is going to shatter and then a piece will just fly out. Okay, and then just straight across. There you go. And you saw that was all in real time. That's how long it takes to cut the plastic. It's very nice. Highly recommend these. These are like my go-to tool for most of the time. So that's all cut off. So now I just need to drill a hole and then just shove this ball joint into that hole. And then the nice thing about these kind of like cross-shaped axles, it's not really focusing right now, but the nice thing about these cross-shaped axles is you can put glue in them and then you can just glue it where you want. If it's perfectly round, the glue probably just won't have enough space. So I'm just going to put a drill hole there. It's actually about 5 millimeters, which ends up being the 3/16. So I'm going to work up to it. First, I'm just going to start with some small pilot holes. So I'm actually going to start with the 3/32. And with this, it's going to be very important that this ball joint actually does not, when it's sunk in, that it actually does not stick out extra at all, because there is actually, when he's transformed, this needs to be pretty much flush. So I need to make sure I don't install the ball joint like this, where it's sticking out. It's got to be pretty much flush like that. And then I like to make a little mark with the hobby knife about where I'm drilling, just to make sure I get the right spot. And that will help keep the drill bit from sliding around when you're making your initial drill. So now you can see I've gouged out a nice little hole there. I used to use, when I first started customizing, I used to really stress out if things were like a millimeter off, but at this point, it doesn't matter. If it's like half a millimeter off, who cares? It's not the end of the world. And you can see, like, cutting out that little ditch to start with really helped the drill bit just not slide around on the plastic. So that's one hole done. So now I just got to increase the size. Okay, so I've drilled that out pretty good. And I actually stopped a couple drill bits underneath the size I actually need. So this is actually not going to fit the way it is. And I do that on purpose because this is cross-shaped. I can now use my hobby knife and cut out like the cross grooves so that this cross-shaped piece will fit. And the reason I like to do that is then when this is all sunk in here, that makes sure that this ball joint is not going to torque. It's not going to get unglued because everything's pretty much fit perfectly. Fit perfectly into this cross shape, so it really is not going to have room to move around. So now I cleaned up that cross shape a little bit, so you can see it's pretty much like a puzzle piece fit. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop that in, and it's very satisfying. That's now in. The ball joint is not going to rotate at all. You can even see this beveled edge is not moving. It just cannot rotate. I don't even really need to glue this because I cut it so exactly that this is just now clipped in place pretty well. So I'm not even going to bother putting in the glue today. And now I just need to cut a channel in this plastic because it's a little bit too thin, and that will allow this gray piece to just sit right in there. So of course I'm going to go back to using this Dremel bit and just widen up. You can see this black plastic. I just need to widen that, basically just wide enough so that this piece will sit in there very nicely. I'm not even going to bother measuring it. I'm just going to go ahead and start dremeling all that plastic out. Before I do that, here's the piece that I cut off earlier from the bicep, right? I always like to keep these little cut off pieces because you never know when they can be useful. In this case, if I just clean out all the support garbage in here, I can actually lodge this in here, and that'll actually make a nice back of his bicep. So it'll be nice and clean looking back there instead of having this. Okay, so basically that's about the right shape, but it's not going deep enough. I need this to go back basically to here, which means all this black plastic right here is in the way. It would take a long time to just Dremel that, so I'm actually just going to use these cuticle nippers. I guess these are kind of like sprue cutters from a Gundam kit, and I'm just going to use that to rip out the plastic because I'm impatient and this is just faster. And anything that needs to be cleaned up I can just shave down with a hobby knife or sand out with a sanding drum. Okay, and that's got enough space to go back, but it's still not low enough, so I need to still Dremel some more of that out. All right, so now we carved out enough of this forearm piece that the ball socket can comfortably fit in, and I have this back of the bicep armor just in place, just to make sure everything's nice and snug, and you can see everything lines up pretty much perfectly. So now I'm just going to get some polyplastic and put it in here just to hold this ball joint in place. That's like what I like to do to fill in gaps. So I'm basically just going to put some polyplastic right down there. And then what I'm going to also do is I'm going to wrap this ball joint in shrink wrap. And then there's also like a little telescoping joint in here. You can see I had to trim some of that down too so that the ball socket would fit. And I'm going to wrap that too because I don't want polyplastic to seize this up and keep it from moving. And again, I'm just going to double check, make sure everything's good so that this trailer can all form up correctly so everything clips into place. And you can see the ball joint right there, so everything's looking good. Okay, and you can see the cling wrap is now protecting this plastic in here, but this black plastic is all exposed. And same thing, this ball socket is all exposed, but the ball joint is also covered because I don't want polyplastic getting into that. And that will effectively glue this to this when I put the polyplastic in there. It'll put those two pieces together. All right, so here's the polyplastic in this little tub. I microwaved it for 2 minutes, so it's ready to go. I'm just going to gently touch this because it's a little bit hot. And I'm just going to wrap it basically around the ball joint. I probably used a little bit too much, and I'm just going to shove that right into that area I dremeled out earlier. And then you got to work pretty quickly with this stuff because after it cools down, it starts getting pretty hard. But you got like a little bit of time to like sculpt it and like clean it up a little bit. So I'm just going to shove this down here. I'm probably going to want to cover this with like a little piece of styrene or something, so that there's not just this gap with ugly polyplastic there. Polyplastic is very hard to sculpt because it dries so quickly. It's not really good for that. I only use it for like fusing two pieces together. And now we just have to wait a couple minutes for that to cool off. All right, I put that in my refrigerator, and this piece is now pretty hard, so I think it's ready to go. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take off these panels. And then I'm going to pop out the ball joint so I can get all the rest of this. Remember, I never glued this, so of course that just came right out. That's okay. Okay, I'm just going to put that right back in the bicep. Okay, all the plastic wrap is gone. And you can see there's like some spillover. So that's just, it's pretty easy to cut off while it's still a little bit warm. You can just really easily scrape that excess off. So that's why you don't have to be too careful. Oops, you can't even see what I'm doing. That's why you don't have to be too careful with polyplastic. And if you misaligned it and you have to do it again, you just yank the whole thing out. And you just melt everything down and try it again. It's really very simple. Okay, so now that ball joint's on, I just need to reattach these pieces. And then this piece I'm just going to glue on back here to the back of the forearm so it doesn't get in the way. I'm going to definitely have to cut this extra plastic off. And that's just to hold the weapon in the trailer mode, so it's not that big a deal. And of course, cutting that off is going to be very easy because I got a good tool for that, where you just do this. And even if you're in a pinch, even the little wire cutter part of the needle nose pliers can be good for this too, if it's not too wide, which it slightly is. Okay, anyway, so I just trim that piece off, and then basically that just gets glued right there, and this would be on the back of the forearm so it stays out of the way. And then you can see he's got now a bicep rotation, so he can move this arm around. All right, this video is already super long, so I think that's all the mods I'm gonna have the time to do today. So let's just compare. This was his original elbow. It only bends about 90 degrees. Remember, his outward motion only goes to here. Now with his improved arm, we get full outward motion. Compared to that arm, you can see a big difference. And then you can get bicep rotation, which this arm does not have, cannot rotate at all. So now he can rotate his forearm, which is very nice. And then he's got a bend, which is, as you can see, over 90 degrees. So great success on this guy. He now has a good amount of articulation. Not that he really needs it, but I don't know. It always bothers me when they don't have these bicep swivels. Anyway, let me know what you think. Is anyone actually going to do this mod? I think it's a lot easier once you know how.